There's something therapeutic about woodworking, almost meditative. I've always been fascinated with this practice, but for a long time I didn't have the courage to take the leap and try it out for myself. Well, 1 year ago I finally decided to take the plunge and, starting from scratch, rented out a workshop and have become a practicing woodworker from a complete novice. The projects in this video are my first 4 pieces of built furniture over the past year. I hope you enjoy watching my journey. This project starts with these ash dowels, which will form the legs of the table. In the first part of this video, I'm cutting in the circular tenons, which will connect the legs to the tabletop. I did this by first cutting the tenon with a hole saw, and then finishing up on the router table. Now, a key design feature of the table will be the horizontal stretchers, which are positioned off-center to the legs. For this I need to use a deep bore hole saw, which can cut through the entire depth of the leg dowel. Then it's just a matter of aligning the holes on the drill press and carefully cutting them out. I used a piece of scrap wood taped to the end to act as a reference of the dowel orientation. This ensured my cuts were always perpendicular to each other. Once I had a system in place, I repeated the process for the other 3 legs. Now I could begin to attach the stretchers, and I'm using a soft wood for this, redwood pine, because I felt the wood had a really dramatic grain, and it would look great at the joint where it intersects with the vertical leg. I firstly glued the stretchers into place. Once dry, I trimmed off the excess with a pull saw. Then the next stage is to shape the joint on my sander. I wanted the curve of the stretcher end to appear tangent to the leg itself, so sanding this whole assembly as one piece was a great way to ensure the joint was seamless. As good as this was, some hand sanding was still required. It was at this point I had to take a break from the workshop for a bit for various other commitments. On my return though, I was so happy to be back, I started moving in slow motion. For the short side stretchers, I had to have a different approach as I couldn't shape the joint as one connected assembly. So instead I had to shape the stretcher ahead of gluing it, and I did this by taping it to a bit of scrap dowel and shaping the end as I did previously. With all the leg assembly parts complete, I could begin to assemble the base together and check the fit. Once I was happy with this, I glued it all up. With the base more or less done, I could turn my attention to the tabletop, which is made of a piece of veneered plywood. I simply had to mark out the spacing for the mortises for my leg tenons in the top. I wanted the end grain of the tenon to be exposed, so using a drill I made the holes go all the way through the tabletop. You know, sometimes working in this small studio, it feels like the more I'm cleaning up things, the more junk actually emerges. So with the tabletop ready, I could join it to my leg assembly, and I realized the fit was very tight, so I just went straight in with the glue. It was at this point I could see a lot of the design details were starting to shine through, and I felt excited to near the completion of the table. The next step was to add edge banding to cover the plywood edges, and for this I used sapele strips, which I cut with my small miter box and a pool saw. I glued these in place and basically taped the living daylights out of them. It almost felt like wrapping up a Christmas present. At this point I could also flush cut my leg tenons. With that all unwrapped, I could now trim down all the excess edge banding, firstly with a block plane. After that I went over everything with an orbital sander, sanding up to 180 grit. I used some wood glue and sawdust to fill in any small holes or gaps. I then made sure to go over the leg assembly with sandpaper up to 180 grit as well, which I had to do by hand, and this went well into the evening. The next day though, I was able to paint on my logo and start to apply the finish. I'm using Osmo Polyx Satin for this, which is a hard wax oil. It was as simple as wiping on with a lint-free cloth, waiting for it to absorb, and then wiping off the excess. And with that, the table was complete. Now, when I said this project is simple at the beginning of this video, it's because it kind of had to be. This is actually my first woodworking project, so I wanted to use this opportunity to build something that aligns with my limited skill set and knowledge. Nonetheless, despite being simple, it still showcases some of the design detailing and joinery approaches I wish to continue to develop over the course of my woodworking journey. This table starts with these pieces of sapele, which have arrived at my workshop planed all round. Sapele wood in general is, in my opinion, an underrated wood, and I wanted this project to highlight some of the natural beauty of the grain. I started by making panels out of the boards which will form the legs of the table. For this, I'm using floating tenon joinery in the form of dowels. You may notice the dowels have been positioned more to one side of the panel. That's because I will later route out a groove detail in one side, so I wanted to make sure I avoided hitting and exposing any dowels. With the dowels in place, I glued up and let it dry. Once dry, I sanded the panels to remove any excess glue spill, and so the joint line is barely noticeable. The base is designed to be somewhat secondary to the tabletop, which will have a feature veneer and will draw most of the attention. As such, I wanted the base to incorporate a robust but more importantly simple geometric joinery, so the focus would be on the top. Next, I'm marking out the cuts for the half-lap joints, which will connect the legs to the stretcher. I cut out the half-laps with a drill and pull saw, and later cleaned them up with a chisel. I wanted to modify the standard half-lap joint by incorporating a small void to better accentuate the joinery. Let's call it a saucy half-lap. This strange shape I'm drawing out will be the mating cut for the half-lap. But first I wanted to add a vertical groove detail to the legs, which corresponds to the half-lap joinery. This was again to better celebrate the joint in a simple geometric way. This gave me a great chance to use this new attachment for my router, which allows me to use it along a track. I then put my router back into the router table, and using a corresponding round over bit, I filleted the outer edges of the legs and stretcher. With that done, I cleaned up the roundovers and sanded out any burn marks. So now I could get around to cutting out that funny shape I was drawing out earlier, and for this I used a pull saw and cleaned up with a chisel. I could then sand the parts and trim the legs to their final length on the miter saw. I taped the legs together to ensure that they would come out exactly the same. With the parts of the base assembly complete, I could then glue it all up. I just wanted to take this chance to say that if you're enjoying the quality content on this channel, such as this shot of my bicep, please consider subscribing. It helps me and the channel out massively. Thank you. So now I could focus on the tabletop, and for that I'm trying book-matched veneering for the first time, using these sheets of Amboina burl, which I was drawn to because they really looked like bacon. I cut a straight edge on both pieces and decided that because the edge was so wavy, it would be better to glue one piece at a time. I later realised this wasn't a good method because there was a lot of glue spill out and it made it harder to then align the second piece precisely. Nonetheless, I pushed on and the first half came out pretty much perfectly. The second half, however, had a lot of bubbling and the seam line was too obvious. So I did what any self-respecting woodworker would do and tried to sand the issue away. I then rubbed on some mineral spirits to see if it was salvageable, but I could tell that it wasn't the look I was really going for. So instead I decided to try again on the other side of the tabletop, using 2 new pieces of veneer. This time I taped them together beforehand and glued them all at once. Now once dry, I know it may look like a mess, but I could tell the seam was much better and there was no bubbling veneer anywhere. So this felt like a big improvement, so I proceeded to sand down the edges and then continue to add edge banding. To connect the top to the base, I'm using figure 8 fasteners. I know these are screwed into the end grain of the base, which is not usually a strong connection, but I tried some test pieces and could tell it would be plenty strong. Next was applying finish, and for that I used Osmo for the base, and my plan was to use a water-based polyurethane for the veneered top. At first the water-based poly looked great for the top, but unfortunately after it cured I felt that it ended up looking too muted, so I decided to sand it back and just stick with the Osmo all over. And that's when this happened. Yep, that veneer was less than 1 mil thick and I just sanded through it. In the end though, I took this as a blessing in disguise. I wasn't really happy with the look of the veneer after all, so in the end this gave me an excuse to go with something a bit more modern. So instead I decided to scrap the veneer completely and make the top from 2 new pieces of sapele. My plan was to cut an interlocking shape into the 2 boards to create a bit of visual interest. I cut this interlocking edge with my new router and cleaned up with a saw and chisel. Now I'm still undecided whether this interlocking panel glue up was really worth it. It was a lot trickier to get the edges to match perfectly than I first thought. But anyway, it's done now. Because I put a lot of effort into this small detail, which may go completely unnoticed, I decided to glue the two pieces up around a contrasting plug, which acts as a kind of keystone and celebrates the joint. I had three options for this plug: sapele, oak and tulip wood, and in the end I felt the tulip wood gave a better contrast, so I went with that. After the top was dry, I gave a round over to the top and bottom of the two ends, again highlighting the strong geometry of the overall piece. I added my logo and finish. And with that, the table was finally complete. This is a table formed from several changes of intention. My original intention was for the base to be less showy than the top, but coming up with a less obtrusive design made me consider some of the more simple details. In doing so, the base became more interesting as a piece of joinery than first thought. Similarly, the tabletop was designed to be the standout element, but following the many failed attempts with veneering, I pivoted to make it more pragmatic, in a way which it could still incorporate a unique joinery detail. As a result, the whole piece has become something it wasn't originally intended to be. However, all these failed attempts and errors gave the chance for creative solutions, and the final piece is one that is better than the one I originally planned. So my first and second veneers may have been a disaster, but it gave the opportunity for such a table to exist. It's finally summer in the city, and this project dragged me out of the depths of winter and into more optimistic times. I'm using these boards for the stretchers of the chair. I'm first marking out and cutting a shape into one of the boards. I found these oak boards at the perfect size on eBay. I currently don't have the means to plane my own timber, so I always buy my pieces planed all round. I then use the first board as a template for the second. I rough cut the second board with a jigsaw and refined the shape on my belt sander. Next I have to cut out the middle part of each stretcher so that I was left with 2 tenons on each stretcher piece. I did this by making several shallow cuts with my miter saw. I then cleaned up this cut with my new router plane, giving a really clean finish. I then gave the pieces a round over on all sides. This left me with a lot of tear out and burn marks, so I could tell there would be a lot of sanding in store for me. I used a standardized length of 65mm for the tenon detail, which would be consistent throughout the piece. I then gave the inner ends of the tenons a round over using a chisel and then refining with a file. The two stretcher pieces are joined using a half lap, and I needed this to be done at a 95-degree angle, so I cut out a paper template and tried to steady my sawing hand. All of my designs are carefully modelled on the computer, so I have a lot of faith in the dimensions that come from the 3D model, and that they align to the size standards for furniture design. It was then that I realised I made the classic mistake of giving the round over to the pieces before making the half lap. This meant that when gluing them together, I'd be left with gaps on either side of the filleted pieces. To fix this, I simply cut out the wrongly filleted portion and glued in a plug, trying to match the grain orientation as best as I could. I then glued up the whole stretcher assembly and checked again my angle was correct. I later trimmed and filed down the plug so the joint looked far better. Next I could move on to the legs, first cutting them to size and adding a round over to both ends. I made a method for cutting mortises into the legs by setting the drill press so that the head just barely cut through to the other side. I then used a small hole as a reference to finish the cut from the other side. This removed any chance of tear out. Once cut, I used a jigsaw to elongate the holes. For the rear legs, I repeated the same method but used some spacers to ensure the holes were cut at a 5-degree angle. This would be important later. With all the holes enlarged, I used this new tool, a Shinto rasp, to refine the edges further. A lot of people ask me where my workshop is based. I actually live on the north side of London, and my workshop is all the way across the city in the south, which is about an hour's commute. If you're enjoying the channel and want to see me continue to make this journey in the name of producing more furniture, please consider subscribing. It allows me to continue doing what I love. Thank you. Back in the workshop, I am now making my own plywood for the seat pan. I decided to do this because I needed to attempt bent lamination for the seat back, so I wanted to keep a consistency between the pan and the back. Once dry, I marked out my seat outline and cut with a jigsaw. This revealed some gaps in my layers, so I tried to fill these with glue and left them to dry. I then centered the stretcher assembly and marked out the cuts for the mortises on the seat. I gave this a round over and sanded the edges. I could then attempt the tricky task of cutting out the mortises in the seat. I just had to be extremely careful and keep cross-checking with the stretcher to ensure I got a tight fit. The idea here is for the seat pan to act as a brace for the stretcher assembly so that it has a functional and a structural purpose. Beyond all my expectations, it actually fit together almost perfectly. Once glued up, I trimmed off the excess and sanded the tenons flush. It was then I realized that because of the nature of plywood, when I tried flush sanding the joint, it revealed the ply layers inconsistently. So with this in mind, I took the radical decision to sand back the top layers of ply to give a better joint overall. In doing so, this revealed some really interesting grain and knots in the layers of birch. Let me know what you think about them. Personally, I think they look great. I then gave a slight round over to the exposed part of the tenon with the Shinto rasp. Next was the part I had been dreading, trying my hand at bent lamination for the seat back. I did a test using ratchet straps with some pieces of 3mm birch, and to my amazement they actually began to bend. So I added glue and strapped them back up. I also used all my clamps just for good measure. Once dry, I cut out the seat back shape with a jigsaw. I then refined the curve with a belt sander. I could then start to dry fit everything and mark out the spacing for each part relative to each other. I even broke out the laser level for guidance. With all the curvatures of the piece, it was hard to line things up accurately. I then trimmed down the excess from the stretchers because this offcut would be used for the tenons for the back. This ensured a visual consistency between all joinery elements. This was also a tricky bit of joinery as I had to cut out the holes in the back to align with the legs, which were at a compound angle. Again, I took my time and cut these as carefully as I could. The really tricky part though was to cut the mortises into the legs to receive the tenons. I first sanded the leg at an angle to give me a flat reference surface. And then I marked the center line. Using the drill press, I made several holes to remove as much material as I could. I then used a chisel to clean up the mortise. It actually amazed me how much more confident I had become with the chisel and with hand tools in general. I managed to get far better control than with my previous projects. I then sanded the tenon flush into the seat back and cut it down to size. I could then begin the very stressful glue up. I took my time with this, and because I had dry fit everything together so many times, it actually all came together very smoothly. Once dried, I could trim off all the excess tenons. I first tried to shape the tenon with a chisel, and that went about as well as expected. So instead I used my block plane, which went far better. Unfortunately, despite all my best efforts, there were still some gaps in the joints. I guess some of the angles were ever so slightly off, and the error built up over the piece as a whole. As much as it pains me to say, I did have to use some wood filler on some of these joints. With a lot of sanding all over, I could then apply finish. The finish really made the oak come to life, and although I didn't quite nail the joints as I hoped, the whole piece really came together as a unified design. And with that, the piece was done. So why would I say that a seemingly nondescript chair is my most ambitious project yet? Well, a chair to me is the combination of good design and good engineering. After all, it needs to support the weight of a whole person while looking good and being comfortable. At the same time, this piece allowed me to be expressive with the language of joinery, and where possible I tried to use the same system for a variety of different uses so that there could be a kind of efficiency between function and structure. This project came about when I acquired these slabs of English bur oak. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of slab tables, but the raw quality of the material made me take inspiration from architecture and the use of rough, natural materials in harmony with crisp, engineered ones. This is a project by Armin Taha in Clerkenwell, which exemplifies this juxtaposition. There's something really tactile about seeing and feeling a material in its natural state. So for this project I selected this small slab due to its interesting grain pattern and the expressiveness of its live edge. My first task was cleaning the slab, which I began by prying out the bits of dead wood with a chisel. I've got to say, cleaning the slab was one of the more satisfying things I've done in woodworking so far. I then moved on to using a wire wheel to clean up the live edge more thoroughly. One issue I noticed was a pretty large crack on one end, so my plan was to route in some splines to prevent any further opening. With the slab preparation up and running, I could move on to the base. The base design was intended to act as a counterpoint to the natural top, giving a crisp frame almost like an engineered scaffolding which the slab had grown around. It also gave me a chance to iterate and improve upon a through tenon detail I'd previously attempted for my Criss-Cross Chair build. Again, I'm using oak for the base so that the materiality is holistic throughout the piece, almost as if both contrasting geometries of the table could have come from the same tree. Previously, when using dowels, I've always had an issue with keeping them square, so this time I cut out some plywood squares to attach to the ends, so I always had a reference of the dowel's orientation. My initial plan was to make the mortises in the legs by lowering the dowels onto my router and then pushing it through by a set length. You know, do you ever find there are times when an idea sounds great on paper, but then when you come about to actually doing it, it just feels incredibly wrong? Well, this was one of those times. I'm sure it's possible, but nothing about this felt good or safe, so I stepped back and tried to find another way. So instead, I prepared this simple jig to lock my dowels in place so that I could make the mortises with my drill press. Using a spacer, I could set where the two end cuts of the mortise would be, and using a brad point bit, I could drill these out very cleanly. From there, I just moved the leg up and down the drill press to hog out the remaining material. I ended up with something like this, and using the sanding attachment for my multi-tool, I could sand the sides of the mortise flat. I also tried chiseling, but this was slightly less successful. In any case, I ended up with pretty good mortises. Then, moving my jig further down and rotating the leg 90 degrees, I could drill in the holes for the lower stretchers. I tried a dry fit and this seemed nice and tight. If you're still watching by this point, I kinda get the feeling you're enjoying the content on this channel, and if so, please consider subscribing. It doesn't cost anything and helps out the channel hugely. Thank you. Next, I prepared all the parts for my stretchers by cutting some 15mm dowel to length and by rounding over some pieces of oak which had been cut to width. With all the parts ready, I broke out the miter saw and cut everything to length, including the legs. This wouldn't be the final length, but it was just to get everything in a more manageable working size. With the legs ready, I gave a slight chamfer to the ends with my disc sander. Now it was time for the glue up. I had been dreading this due to how tight I wanted the joints to be and how many pieces would have to come together at different angles. So I took this slow and did it in parts. The first part was half of the leg sub-assembly, which consisted of a leg and two stretchers. I then glued this part into another leg and this would give me a completed sub-assembly. Now I have to say, it never feels good to hammer something you've spent so much time on with this much force, but I just really wanted to get the joints tight this time. For the next glue up though, I decided to sand down the ends just a bit to make the fit a bit easier. Anyway, somehow I ended up with the two leg sub-assemblies. I could then use these parts to mark out the positioning for the top stretchers. I lined these up with the slab to make sure these stretchers wouldn't stick out from the underside of the slab top. I'm attaching the top stretchers with a half lap, so I cut this out with my pull saw. Next came the task of gluing the two leg ends together via the middle stretcher, and I thought using a clamp could help here. I was definitely wrong. In the end, I went with the trusty method of persuading it with my hammer. With the hardest part completed, I just needed to glue in the top stretchers, which was far more sedate by comparison. With the leg assembly out of clamps, I could cut the tenons to length and then sand them flush. Coming back to the slab, I still needed to remove the sharper points of the live edge. I definitely wanted there to be some nubs and geometry of the burr, but I didn't want anyone to injure themselves on the table. The idea was that when you touch the table, maybe to reposition it, it should feel like you're holding a piece of a tree. One detail I really wanted to do was cut in a more geometric shape into the slab where it overlaps with the leg. This would give the impression of the slab growing around the base. I would have loved to have done this detail at every leg if the slab was bigger, but in the end I'm glad I could at least do it on one leg. As I explained in a previous video, all you need really is that one moment of magic, something unique that really defines the piece. You don't really need more than that. So although I'll know that the hardest part of this build was wrestling with the fit of the base, I know to the average person the bit that stands out most is probably this small, simple leg detail. But I needed to wrestle with the base and get the precision of that fit perfect in order to allow this moment to really shine. Next I cut the slab to its final length. I wanted to keep the small burr holes open, but just wanted to fill in any bigger holes. For the harder to reach holes, I used some CA glue. Once sanded, I could add my logo. To attach the top to the base, I used figure-8 fasteners as I was worried about the movement of the slab relative to the base. I could then apply finish. For the top, I'm using Osmo Polyx Satin. This looked great and highlighted all the special details of the wood. However, one detail I wasn't convinced with was leaving the burr holes open. So I went back and filled these all with a wax stick. This took a while and was quite worrying as it looked like a complete mess at first, but it was nothing a little sanding couldn't rectify. After that I could get back to continue finishing. For the base I'm going for Osmo Raw to give a better contrast between the base and the top. I also then added another coat of the satin to the top. And with that the table was complete. Wood is a natural material. It comes in all shapes and forms. With this piece, I tried to celebrate those individualities while at the same time making an attempt to conform something natural into something as designed and engineered as a piece of furniture. As such, this project helped me in recognizing the inherent duality of my practice. Whether natural or engineered, they are two sides of the same coin. Like, for example, making furniture and making YouTube videos. And I guess in the end, both sides come from the same roots.